me join Birgit in thanking the three partners of the report and also the many others who contributed to this. So the forum's community of chief risk officers, the Global Future Council on Frontier Risks, the Global Advisory Board of the risk practice at the forum, and of course, the lead authors of the report headed by Emilio Granados Franco, Melinda Koritsky, and Richard Lukács. Let me move on to those results and perhaps first just share that there are 6 chapters overall in the report. We look at this possibility of fractured futures that Birgit just talked about. But in addition, we deep dive into what we're calling Error 404, the risks from a widening digital gap. Pandemials, which is this doubly disrupted generation that saw both the financial crisis and now the pandemic-induced recession. Middle power morass, which is looking at geopolitical instability and how middle powers need to fight to still keep a seat at the table. Imperfect markets that looks at the economic fallout and the industrial shakeout that is happening across sectors. And then finally, a chapter on hindsight that looks at the lessons that we can extract from how we dealt with the pandemic and how that can be deployed towards other global risks. So very quickly on the results, if we could have that first slide up. The first aspect that we tried to look at is the timeframes that are involved. So which are the risks that are likely to play out in the next couple of years, those clear and present dangers, which ones come up in the next 3 to 5 years after that are essentially knock-on effects, and then finally the longer-term existential threats. When it comes to the first couple of years, it's very much what Birgit laid out. It's not just the health crisis, but it's also the unemployment crisis that has been induced by the recession. It's also the digital divides, and it is also cybersecurity failure. These are all concerns over the next 2 years. Beyond that, you start looking at some of the economic fallout. So, for example, the possibility of debt crisis, the possibility of commodity shocks, the possibility of price instability, and of course, across all of this, youth disillusionment also comes up in the next couple of years as well as after that. And then finally, the 5 to 10 years out, you see those existential threats, and that includes climate change first and foremost, but also concerns about state collapse and also concerns about weapons of mass destruction. If we could move on to the next slide, there's the next lens to this, which is trying to assess the highest likelihood and highest impact risks. And this, it is absolutely clear that if you look at the next 10 years out, the most problematic risk that the world faces is still climate change. There is no vaccine for this. There is only the actions that we can take today to build more sustainable economies. And then finally, a last lens that we tried to apply is, regardless of the impact and likelihood, there are certain risks that global leaders are more concerned about compared to others, and certain risks that have a higher connectivity with other risks. And there, perhaps a couple of key messages that would be important to take away. One, climate action failure still comes up as the most important, most concerning risk, and one which is most connected to man-made environmental degradation. And the second that perhaps is important to look at, this rising erosion of social cohesion that comes in part from livelihood crisis, in part from the environmental crisis, and in part from a generational shift, in particular the pandemials that have been most affected by the current crisis.